You know that moment when you realize the universe has a very strange sense of humor? Yeah, that was me, standing on a creaky wooden platform, staring up at a glacier that looked more like a frozen ocean than something you could actually hike on. And then I found out I was assigned the same bunk as the guy who'd been quietly stealing my snacks the whole trip. Okay, let me back up a bit. I signed up for this glacier hiking tour mostly because I wanted to prove something to myself. Not that I'm some extreme adventurer or anything. I'm the kind of guy who'd rather binge watch a series on the couch than climb an actual mountain. But after a rough breakup and a year stuck in a rut, I figured, why not? Something wildly out of my comfort zone might just knock some sense back into me. The group was small, about a dozen people, mostly solo travelers like me. Our guide was this grizzled, no-nonsense guy named Lars, who clearly hadn't smiled since the last ice age. We'd been trekking across the glacier for 2 days, dodging crevasses, slipping on ice, and trying not to freeze our faces off. The kind of trip where you bond with strangers in the most unglamorous ways possible, sharing body heat, swapping last bars of granola, and collectively freaking out when someone's crampon broke. So on day 3, after a brutal morning climb, we finally reached the mountain hut, where we'd sleep, before pushing toward the summit. This place was basically a wooden box perched on the ice, with rows of bunks packed tight enough that you could hear your neighbor's snores echoing like a creepy cave orchestra. That's when the assignment sheet went up. I scanned the paper, expecting to see my name next to some random bunk number. Instead, I read, Bunk 6, Jamie. I blinked and looked up at the guy standing beside me, who had just casually grabbed his gear and said, "Looks like we're bunkmates." Jamie had been this quiet presence throughout the trip, tall, with messy brown hair, and these glasses that always slid down his nose as he tried to peer through the fogging up of his goggles. We'd exchanged polite nods and the occasional, "Careful on that ice, it's slippery," but nothing personal. Honestly, I didn't even know his last name. And suddenly, we were going to share the same tiny sleeping space on a glacier thousands of feet above sea level. Now, I don't know about you, but sharing a bunk with someone you barely know, in a freezing hut with no privacy, felt like the kind of situation you see in a bad reality show. Yet, there was something about Jamie's calm way of moving, the way he shrugged off the cold, that made me think this could either be a disaster or the start of something completely unexpected. As we hauled our gear into the cramped room, I caught a glimpse of the sunset glowing pink and orange over the ice field outside. It was stunning, almost surreal how peaceful everything looked, even though I was about to spend the night inches away from a guy who, until now, was basically a stranger stealing my snacks. So yeah, that's where things stood. 2 guys, 1 tiny bunk, a glacier that could swallow us whole, and a weird kind of tension that neither of us seemed ready to name yet. Little did I know this frozen wasteland was about to become the most unpredictable and eye-opening place I'd ever find connection. Jamie slid open the creaky wooden door and stepped inside first, glancing around like he was mentally mapping the tiny space. I followed close behind, trying to ignore the sudden rush of self-consciousness that hit me the moment I realized we were about to be cohabiting a space the size of a shoebox. The room smelled like damp wool and old boots, and the single dim bulb overhead flickered just enough to remind you that electricity here was a luxury, not a guarantee. "Bunk 6, Jamie muttered, nodding to one of the 2 stacked bunks against the wall. "Top or bottom?" I hesitated. I usually prefer top bunks. Something about feeling more in control, less vulnerable. But at this altitude and temperature, climbing up and down on a rickety ladder felt like a bad idea. Plus, the bottom bunk was closer to the heater vent, which was a little thing but a game changer in a place that felt like a walk-in freezer. "You pick," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out a little higher than I intended. He smiled. Just a flicker, but enough to make me catch my breath. "I'm fine with bottom. You take the top." I nodded and started hauling my bag up the ladder. As I settled into the cramped space, I realized just how thin the mattress was. A few inches of foam barely padded the wooden slats beneath. I shifted, trying to find a comfortable spot, but every movement made the bunk creak like it might collapse. Then, from below, Jamie's voice came up. "Don't worry, it's solid." Lars might be grumpy, but his carpentry skills are legit. I laughed softly. "Good to know. We spent the next few minutes unpacking in silence, the kind that's not uncomfortable, but charged, like we were both weighing what to say next. The wind howled outside, rattling the window frames, reminding me that we were miles from anything resembling civilization. Finally, Jamie broke the silence. "So you from around here?" "Not even close," I replied. "I'm from Seattle. Needed a change of scenery, I guess. What about you?" "Toronto," he said. "I actually work in environmental science. This trip's part research, part vacation. Sounds way more interesting than my 'I'm trying not to die on a glacier' plan," he chuckled. "Hey, that's important too. Survival skills are underrated." That was the moment I noticed how close we actually were. The top bunk barely had room for me to stretch out, and my legs were dangling just over his headspace. Our breaths were visible in the cold air, and I could smell the faint scent of pine shampoo mixed with the metallic tang of glacier air clinging to his jacket. A sudden knock on the door startled us both. It was Lars, the guide, holding a thermos. "Hot tea. Figured you two might want some before lights out." Grateful, we both reached out, grabbing cups from him. Jamie's fingers brushed mine briefly, and I felt a little jolt, not cold, but something else. "Thanks," Jamie said, his voice quieter. "Yeah, appreciated," I added, suddenly a little more aware of the closeness. Lars gave us a knowing look, then left with a grunt, leaving us alone again. We sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through me, warding off the chill. Jamie leaned back against the wall, eyes drifting over the frost-lined window. "You ever think about how small this place is? Like, the whole world up here is just ice and silence." "Yeah," I said. "Kind of humbling." "In a weird way." He smiled, that same flicker from before. "Humbling's one word for it. I feel like I'm more aware of every breath, every heartbeat." I nodded, suddenly feeling like this trip was about more than just trekking glaciers. It was stripping away all the noise I usually hide behind and finding something raw and real. "Hey," Jamie said suddenly, "you want to hear something kinda ridiculous?" "Always," I replied. He grinned. "So yesterday, I accidentally ate the last energy bar you had." I blinked. "Wait, seriously?" That explains why I was freaking out when I couldn't find it. "Yeah, sorry. I was starving, and it was right there in your pack. Didn't think you'd notice." I laughed, shaking my head. "Man, that's low." But fair. We both laughed, that easy kind that feels like old friends, not strangers forced to share a bunk on a glacier. As the night deepened, the wind outside picked up, howling like it wanted to knock the hut off its foundation. I realized I hadn't felt this alive in months, not just physically from the cold and exertion, but something deeper. The way Jamie looked over at me, the quiet moments we shared, even the ridiculous bunk situation. It was all strangely comforting. Before I knew it, I was spilling a little about my past. The breakup, the loneliness, the endless nights of feeling stuck. Jamie listened without interrupting, just letting his presence fill the space between my words. When I finished, he said softly, "I get it. Sometimes you have to go somewhere cold and unforgiving to find out what's really warm inside." I smiled, not sure if I was talking about the tea or him. We settled into a companionable silence, the kind where words aren't necessary. The cold outside felt distant now, muffled by the walls and the unexpected warmth that was starting to grow between us. And just like that, the glacier didn't seem so lonely anymore. Morning came with the kind of cold that bites through even the thickest layers, and somehow, that tiny hut on the glacier felt like the least warm place on Earth. I woke up shivering, half expecting to find frost on the inside of my sleeping bag. Instead, I felt a steady heat radiating from somewhere below me. I blinked, slowly adjusting my eyes to the dim light filtering through the frost-cracked window. There was Jamie, still awake on the bottom bunk, his eyes just barely open, watching me like he'd been waiting for me to stir. The sight caught me off guard, and I realized I was probably stirring like a total idiot. "Cold night?" he asked quietly. "You could say that," I admitted. "How are you not freezing down there?" He smirked a little. "Body heat. Plus, I might have scooted a little closer to the heater vent." I looked over to the little metal box in the corner, glowing faintly. Guess we're both stealing warmth from the same source. There was this easy rhythm to how we spoke, like the glacier outside had hollowed the space between us of distractions and left only the essentials. And maybe that's why the silence felt so natural. No pressure to fill it with small talk or forced smiles. After a few minutes, Jamie finally shifted, sitting up more. I don't think I ever caught your full story. What happened back home? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It was messy. My last boyfriend and we just stopped being able to talk. Things got toxic, but we stuck it out longer than we should have. I guess I needed this trip to remind myself there's a world beyond heartbreak. He nodded thoughtfully. I get that. I had something similar not long ago. It's like you carry that weight with you until you find a way to set it down. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, how I'd stayed in my apartment for weeks after the breakup, how I'd barely left the city, feeling like I was drowning in my own thoughts. But then I realized Jamie didn't need the whole tragic saga. The fact that he understood was enough. We got up, stretching cramped limbs, and prepared for the day's hike. Dressing in layers, I noticed Jamie fussing with his gloves, like he was trying to warm up fingers that refused to cooperate. You good? I asked, offering a little smile. Yeah, he said, glancing up. Just not a morning person, or maybe glaciers aren't either. We laughed, the sound echoing softly in the tight space. Outside, the sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a pinkish glow across the vast expanse of jagged ice. The glacier stretched out like an endless sea of cracked glass, sparkling under the early light. It was breathtaking and terrifying all at once. As we strapped on our crampons and clipped into our harnesses, Jamie turned to me. Ready to tackle the ice again? Only if you're leading the way, I joked. He shot me a playful look. Don't flatter yourself. I'm just hoping I don't fall into a crevasse. We fell into step behind Lars, who was already moving confidently ahead, his voice carrying instructions and warnings over the crunching of boots on ice. The hike was brutal. Every step required focus. One wrong move, and you could slip and slide into a frozen abyss. Yet as we moved, I found myself stealing glances at Jamie. There was something captivating about the way he balanced strength and caution, his brow furrowed in concentration but his eyes alive with quiet determination. At one point, we crossed a narrow ice bridge spanning a deep crevasse. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might freeze up. Jamie noticed, slowing down beside me. Hey, he said softly, just one step at a time. I've got your back. That simple sentence, coming at just the right moment, made my pulse steady. I nodded, gripping my poles tighter, and together we made it across. By the time we reached a small plateau, the sun was higher, warming the ice just enough to melt some of the frost. Jamie pulled out a small camera, and for the first time, he seemed relaxed, even playful. Want to take a picture? This place is insane. I hesitated, then smiled. Sure. He adjusted the lens, then motioned for me to stand next to him. As the shutter clicked, our shoulders brushed, and I felt a spark, or maybe it was just the cold. But when I looked at him, he was already looking back, eyes a little softer than before. We sat down on a smooth patch of ice for a snack break. Jamie pulled out some trail mix and offered me some. I accepted and then surprised myself by reaching out to bump his shoulder lightly. Looks like we're officially friends now, I teased. He grinned. That's a relief. I was worried you might never speak to me again after the snack theft. We laughed again, the sound mingling with the whisper of wind and distant cracking ice. For the first time, the glacier didn't feel like a barren, hostile place. It felt like the backdrop to something new, something fragile but worth holding on to. As we packed up and started the descent, I realized I was looking forward to the evenings in that cramped hut, to the quiet conversations and shared warmth. Maybe this trip was more than just a way to get over my past. Maybe it was the start of something I hadn't dared hope for, a chance to find connection in the most unlikely place. That night, back in the hut, the wind had picked up into a proper storm. The walls rattled, and the icy gusts whistled through the cracks in the wood like some wild animal trying to claw its way in. I was lying on the top bunk, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest when Jamie's voice cut through the darkness. Hey, you awake? I shifted, blinking in the dim light. Yeah, what's up? He was sitting on the edge of his bunk, knees pulled to his chest, looking out the frost-covered window. I don't know if it's just the altitude or the storm, but I can't stop thinking about how small we are out here. I nodded. It's humbling, right? Makes everything else seem distant. He turned to look at me, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern. Yeah, it's like all the noise we carry with us, The doubts, the fears, they get stripped away. All that's left is this moment and who we are in it. There was something about the way he said it that made my heart beat a little faster. Like he wasn't just talking about the glacier, but about life, about everything we'd both been running from. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. I've never been good at living in the moment. Always planning, worrying, second-guessing. Jamie smiled softly. Me too. But maybe that's why moments like this hit so hard. Because they remind us there's more than just the noise. We sat in silence for a while. The storm howling outside. The hut creaking and groaning under the weight of ice and wind. I felt a strange sense of peace. Like being here with Jamie made the cold less biting, the darkness less overwhelming. After a while, he spoke again. Quieter this time. You ever think about what happens after trips like this? When we go back to our normal lives? I thought about it. Honestly, part of me worries I'll forget this feeling, that I'll slip back into old patterns and the loneliness. Jamie nodded, pulling his knees tighter. Me too. But maybe the important part is what we choose to remember, what we bring back with us. That felt like an invitation, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to take it. So instead, I just said, thanks for being here. I mean, for real. It makes a difference. He smiled again, that flicker of warmth that had become my favorite thing. Right back at you. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the glacier sparkling under a clear blue sky. We were scheduled to make the final push to the summit, and the air buzzed with a mix of exhaustion and excitement. As we packed our gear, Jamie caught me staring at him, that easy smile spreading across his face. Nervous? A little, I admitted. But also, I don't know. Ready, I guess, he nodded, adjusting his pack. Same. Let's do this. The climb was brutal. The sun beat down on us, reflecting off the ice with blinding intensity. The air was thin, making every step a conscious effort. But Jamie was a steady presence beside me, encouraging without pressure, sharing quiet jokes when the tension started to build. At one point, I slipped on a patch of ice, my crampons barely holding. Jamie reached out, grabbing my arm and steadying me. Our hands lingered longer than necessary, and I felt a spark shoot through me. Careful, he said, voice low. Thanks, I breathed, suddenly aware of how close we were. We made it to the summit just as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The view was breathtaking, an endless expanse of ice and snow stretching out like a frozen ocean. Jamie and I stood side by side, shoulders touching, sharing a quiet moment that felt like an unspoken promise. I'm glad we got stuck sharing that bunk, I said softly. He looked at me then, eyes searching. Me too. The descent back to the hut was quieter, the accomplishments settling over us like a warm blanket. That night, as we lay in our cramped bunks, the wall seemed less like a prison and more like a cocoon, holding us safe from the cold and the past. Before sleep took me, I heard Jamie whisper, maybe this is just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. I woke up the next morning with a strange mix of tiredness and a weird kind of excitement buzzing in my chest. The climb to the summit was behind us, but something about the air inside that cramped hut felt different now, like we'd crossed some invisible line, and nothing was quite the same. Jamie was already up, sitting on the edge of his bunk, packing his gear with that quiet focus he always had when he was in his element. I watched him for a second, the way the morning light caught the edges of his hair, the faint crease between his eyebrows. I realized I'd been thinking about him more than I expected, more than just as a bunkmate or the guy who'd stolen my snacks. Morning, I said, trying to sound casual, even though my voice felt a little rough from disuse. He looked up and smiled, that slow, easy grin that made me feel like maybe I wasn't just imagining things. Morning, did you sleep okay? Better than expected, I admitted. I guess the exhaustion helped. Jamie laughed softly. Yeah, nothing like a glacier to knock you out. We moved around the tiny room, packing our things in silence. But the silence wasn't heavy. It felt comfortable, like we didn't need to fill every second with words. When we stepped outside, the air was crisp and clear. The glacier bathed in a cool blue light that made everything feel surreal. The rest of the group was stirring, getting ready to head back down the mountain to base camp. As we walked together, the crunch of our boots on the ice was the only sound for a few minutes. Then Jamie broke the quiet. "So what's next for you after this? Any big plans?" I shrugged. "Honestly, not really. I think I just wanted this trip to shake things up, make me feel something. And it did, but I don't know what comes after." He glanced at me, eyes thoughtful. Maybe that's the point. Not knowing. Sometimes the best things happen when you leave space for them. I wanted to argue, to say I preferred control, certainty, but the truth was, Jamie's words hit a chord. We got back to base camp by mid-afternoon. The relative warmth in crowds were a shock after the quiet isolation of the glacier. People were laughing, sharing stories, taking photos, life buzzing around us. That evening, after dinner, the group gathered around a fire pit outside the main lodge. The air smelled of wood smoke and melted snow. Jamie and I found a spot next to each other on a log bench, and for the first time, neither of us seemed in a rush to fill the space with small talk. So I said, poking the fire with a stick, "Did you really eat the last of my granola bars?" He chuckled. "Guilty. But I brought you a peace offering." He pulled a small bar out of his jacket pocket and held it out. I accepted it with a grin. "You're lucky I'm forgiving." Jamie's eyes twinkled. "I plan on being forgiven. And maybe more." The air between us shifted, electric somehow. I could feel the warmth from the fire, but it was nothing compared to the heat rising in my chest. Later, when the group started to drift back inside, Jamie and I lingered by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Our favorite music, the books we'd read, the places we wanted to visit. At one point, he reached over and brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. It was such a gentle motion that it made me stop breathing for a second. "I'm glad we ended up sharing that bunk," he said softly. "Me too," I whispered back. The night air was cold, but it didn't matter. When he slipped his hand into mine, the world felt warm and full of possibility. We walked back inside, side by side, the noise and light of the lodge swallowing us up, but the connection between us stayed sharp and real. That trip started as a way to escape, to push myself out of a rut. But as we packed up to leave, I realized it had become something so much more. Jamie wasn't just a bunkmate on a glacier. He was the unexpected path forward. And as we stood there, saying goodbyes to the rest of the group, I found myself hoping this was just the beginning of a story neither of us saw coming. The bus ride back to town was quieter than I expected. Most of the group were either asleep or staring out the windows, lost in their own thoughts. Jamie and I ended up sitting next to each other, knees almost touching. The air between us charged but unspoken. I kept stealing glances at him, noticing the way his eyes softened when he wasn't focused on the road ahead or the passing landscape. There was something about the way the glacier trip had stripped away our usual guards, leaving us exposed in the best way possible. So, I finally broke the silence. "What happens when we get back to real life? Does this all just become a weird story about two guys who shared a bunk on a glacier?" Jamie smiled, a little mischievous. "I hope not. I'm planning on seeing you again. Maybe grab coffee, or something less adventurous, but safer for my ankles." I laughed. "Yeah, I'd like that. I'm not sure I'm cut out for glacier hiking every weekend." We talked more as the town got closer, sharing phone numbers and tentative plans that felt both thrilling and terrifying. We both knew that going back home meant stepping out of the bubble we'd lived in for the past week. But somehow, that didn't seem so daunting anymore. The next few days were a blur of catching up with family and friends, unpacking, and trying to settle back into a routine. But I kept thinking about Jamie, the way he looked at me that night by the fire, the steady presence he'd been throughout the trip. One evening, I found myself scrolling through my phone, rereading our messages, feeling that familiar flutter in my chest. So I took a deep breath and called him. "Hey," Jamie answered, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey," I said, smiling even though he couldn't see me. "I was wondering if you wanted to meet up this weekend. Maybe somewhere flat and warm." He laughed. "Sounds perfect." When Saturday came, we met at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place with cozy chairs and too many plants. Jamie was already there, waving as I walked in. Looking just as nervous and hopeful as I felt, we talked for hours. About everything and nothing. The conversation flowed easily. The kind of connection that doesn't need grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Just two people figuring out how to be close without rushing. At one point, Jamie reached across the table, his hand finding mine. The touch was electric, but comforting, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm glad you called," he said softly. "Me too," I whispered back. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other as much as we could, hiking local trails, cooking dinner together, staying up late talking about dreams and fears. The glacier trip became less of a distant memory and more the foundation of something growing between us. There were moments of awkwardness, of course. Times when the past crept in, reminding me why I had been so scared to trust again. But Jamie was patient, steady, and genuine. The kind of person who doesn't rush but doesn't let go either. One evening, as we walked along the river near my apartment, the city lights reflecting off the water, Jamie stopped and looked at me. "Do you ever think about how we met? On a glacier, sharing a bunk, freezing our butts off?" I laughed. "Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago." He smiled, eyes shining. "I'm glad it happened. I didn't expect to find us. "Neither did I admitted. "But I'm glad I did." We stood there for a moment, the noise of the city fading into the background. Then Jamie leaned in, his lips soft against mine, and I felt the world tilt in the best way possible. That night, I realized the glacier wasn't just a place on a map. It was where I found something I thought was lost. And with Jamie beside me, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because sometimes, the most unexpected journeys lead to the most unforgettable destinations. Months passed, and with each one, Jamie and I found a rhythm that felt less like figuring it out and more like coming home. It wasn't always perfect. There were days when life's chaos crept in, when old doubts whispered in the quiet moments. But we faced those days together, steady and patient. One chilly evening, we ended up back at my apartment after a slow walk through the park. The city was a cold, glowing grid outside the window, but inside, the space felt warm with soft light and the scent of brewing tea. Jamie sat close on the couch, his hand resting lightly on mine. I looked over at him, the familiar comfort of his presence settling around me like a favorite sweater. "You know," he said, voice low and thoughtful, "I never imagined a glacier would be the place I met someone who changed everything." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Neither did I, but maybe that's the thing about unexpected places. They break you open in ways you didn't know you needed." He nodded, eyes reflecting the warmth between us. "Being with you feels like that, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, even when the world feels uncertain. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic leap. Just two people who'd carried their scars and fears up a frozen mountain and back down into something tender and real." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "Thank you for being my anchor." He smiled softly. "And you're mine." That night, as the city hummed beyond the window, I realized that love didn't always arrive with fireworks or fanfare. Sometimes it showed up quietly, in shared warmth during cold nights, in stolen smiles over burnt toast, in knowing someone sees you completely and still chooses to stay. The glacier was behind us now, but what it gave us stayed, a reminder that even in the coldest, hardest places, connection can grow. And with Jamie, I was ready to keep walking forward, wherever the path might lead. Because sometimes, the most unexpected journeys bring you exactly where you need to be.